Um, cool. All right, we're just going to kick it off with the title. God is Performance, Church is Drag, How the Art of Drag Has Evolved to Belong in Our Pulpits. I am your presenter, King Julez. All right, we'll just hop right in. Let's go to the next slide. So a layout of our time together today, I'm going to start with an introduction, who I am, kind of why I'm relevant, why what I say about this topic actually holds some value. I'm going to walk us through the arts of performance and glamour, war and freak, charisma and influence, and these breakdown of categories and layout are inspired by The Art of Drag, which is a book that is pictured here. It is a really phenomenal book, and the art in it is really inspiring as well. Once we get through those categories, I'm going to briefly touch on and talk about the student Christian movement and Judith Butler and some things that she has said. And then we're going to conclude with the Bible and some scripture about performance, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation about that. At any point that you are inspired throughout this conversation, you're welcome to paint yourself or a canvas, any part, any way, any color that you feel called to do so. There's no designated painting time specifically in our time together, but there's going to be time at the end to talk about what we've created, if anything. All right. So who am I? I am King Julez. I use they, them pronouns always. I live and work in Toronto, which is a part of the Treaty 13 territories and is on the lands that have been taken from the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. I am a white, fourth generation, Canada-born, English and Scottish settler. I'm a non-binary transgender drag performer. So I'm neither a queen nor a king specifically, but someone who pushes those boundaries. And I've been finding more enjoyment recently in my clown drag, as there is one, no gender to a clown specifically, and two, I can be goofy and silly and colorful in every possible way that I can think of. I have been doing drag for about 2 years, 2.5 years, but only seriously started thinking about it with my ministry within the last year or so. I recently passed my first interview in the process to become a minister in the United Church of Canada. I also sit on as the secretary on the Council of Affirm United, which is an organization that partners with the United Church of Canada to guide communities through education and conversations in order to gain affirming status. For me, I discern my call to ministry in the same that I discern my transition and my drag. And all of those things come together in prayer. Each and every day I wake up and I ask myself what makes me the most comfortable. This can mean presentation, this can mean mannerisms, this can be my voice. And I listen to my sense of self. Whenever I'm getting into drag, I look at the inspiration that I'm taking from, and then I just set myself free to paint with how the spirit moves with me and moves in me in that period of time. I listen for the word of God in scripture, and I look for the face of God in every person that I meet. These all revolve around my constant connection to what God is calling me to do and to be in the world. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction here. You know, what is drag in the first place? Throughout history, it's been used for a variety of purposes, and we will explore a lot of those here. But largely, as a whole, drag sets to challenge societal norms and transgress boundaries that are placed on us as individuals. Cross-dressing as an act has in and of itself been around for centuries, around the globe, across cultures, but the term drag was coined in an 1870 version of a UK newspaper when an ad was printed that said, "We shall come in drag," which means men dressed in women's costumes. And since that ad was placed, that term has kind of stuck around. Next, please. Thank you. So the arts of performance and glamour. Drag artists find their inspiration everywhere around them. Some find inspiration from other artists, from history, from politics, from the natural world. We are going to go all the way back to about 400 and bring ourselves straight to where we are now. So drag and performance as we know it today has taken little pieces of cultural performances from all around the world. It's important to note that I will be bringing us to an understanding that drag has no one source, but it is an amalgamation of many art forms that surround pushing boundaries and entertaining both oneself and an audience. Listed here are the arts that we'll be beginning with, dating all the way back to Greek mime, and then we'll walk through Shakespearean theater, Kabuki theater, and a few others listed. Next, please. So here's some imagery, and I'm just going to kind of guide you through some of those names that I was just talking about. In the top left corner, we see here some ancient or some Greek mime from around that time frame. Using a combination of dance and interaction with audience members, mimes entertained at festivals, telling stories and putting on skits. The most famous mimes of all were the ones who broke from the chorus and were over the top and really exaggerated. In the middle on the top, we see an image from some Shakespearean theater. While women were barred from the stage, men took over in what were obvious women roles. Shakespeare's heroines aren't necessarily central characters, but they could be when they're one that's going to cross-dress, such as Viola in Twelfth Night. Gender was a complicated role in Shakespearean theater, where there was often a second or even third layer to it. The top right corner is the Kathakali dance, which is typically performed by men and is traditionally based on Hindu folklore. These dances told stories through elaborate music, dance, and singing, as well as costumes, as you can see here. In the bottom left corner, we have the Peking opera from China, which originated in the 18th century. Of course, music and glamorous makeup were at the core, but there was a fresh emphasis in this opera on acrobatics and exceedingly colorful palettes that set apart this brand of opera from the others of the area. The leading female roles, called the Dan, could be only played by men up until 1912. These male performers wore particularly demure makeup compared to the other characters in the opera. They were intricate, embellished silk robes and were amongst what are considered to be the original drag artists. In the middle on the bottom, we can see a Kabuki theater setup in Japan. Kabuki was originally begun by a woman, Izumo no Okuni, and she built a troupe and they danced in typical male clothing. In 1629, women were banned from Kabuki theater because the government thought that the women were too erotic, and the show that they were putting on was too rowdy. So this led to the rise in onagata, which were male artists playing female roles. They were dedicated to soft beauty, femininity, and delicacy. While the plot lines of Kabuki theater have grown more complex over the last 400 years, the dancing and the traditional costumes have largely stayed the same. And in the bottom right corner is an image from the book, actually, that I'm referencing. We see in the very bottom the Kosek and Senji performers of the Ottoman Empire. While the harems of women were well known in this empire, there were male counterparts to belly dance and play music as well. These entertainers wore long curled hair, long silk shirts, and heavy makeup to create an all over effect when they were there. It's rumored that these performers were higher in demand than the women and caused a lot of tension in the households and in the troops. Next, please. On the left, we can see Vaudeville Theater Troupe. These were troupes originating in France and then elsewhere. They would combine comedy and satirical songs to create an all singing, all dancing showcase of performers. Drag artists naturally gravitated to this kind of humor and take on the world, as they were poking fun and really there to put on a show. This became an opportunity to joke and poke fun at gender as well with larger audiences as the theater went on. Pantomime theater in Britain was the beginnings of many drag king careers. Women were landed for principal boy parts, such as Peter Pan, for example, and the cross-dressing would become a gag in the show, as so these women were escaping femininity and were escaping the confines of dresses and things like that. In these two theaters, artists understood that a little bit of laughter and entertainment made the illusion easier to digest and easier to understand. We still see this in insane amounts today, right? Okay, so of the three images on the right, in the top left, so the middle image in the top, is Florence Hines. And Florence Hines was a Black drag king who began as part of the Creole show, which was put on in deviation from the time's popular racist minstrel shows. Florence Hines was dapper, fashionable, and an upper class, reportedly earning the highest salary of any Black woman of the time. So really influential of the time period. The other two here are Ella Shields and in the bottom Anne Hindle. While there are drag artists and stars of the time, cross-dressing was still illegal also in most US states. When cross-dressing took place anywhere but on a stage, people were not forgiving and were often violent. Next, please. Moving into the 1900s to the 1950s, this era aimed for realness and femininity over the campy history. So here we see a rise in female impersonation amidst the jazz age in the United States. The jazz age in the US surrounded the popularization of music and dance from Black cultures. It's important to acknowledge that without the often unrecognized work of Black artists and creatives, none of these performers would have been able to find success. During this time, Black musicians, flapper girls, and drag artists alike were being put on the stage and celebrated for their talents and were some of the biggest stars of the time period. So this is, obviously very different, right? We see here a few names, and I'm going to get into some of them in the next, I'll get into them in the next slide. In the top left here, we have Julian Eltinge. His drag revolved around what he called the full feminine fantasy, including flawless makeup, intricate teased wigs, and glamorous gowns, often convincing the audiences that he was a woman. Eltinge worked at the same time as someone named Bert Savoy, who took a different route, far more over the top and coining phrases that we use today, like "you slay me" and "you don't know the half of it." Their charisma always seeped through in whatever they did. In the middle on the top, we see the Rocky twins. Their looks were signature 1920s, as you can see from this image here, sporting short wigs, rimmed eyeliner, and bright lips. They often wore flapper gowns and feather stoles as well. When they were out as men, they wore tuxedos and polished shoes, so they really dazzled crowds wherever they went with their ability to jump back and forth. In the top right, we see Josephine Baker. She built her reputation as a vaudeville star and moved to Paris, finding fame as an erotic dancer, an actress, and an entertainer. She performed femininity in an over-the-top way, as deliberate as drag artists are doing the same. She mastered a campy, sexy appeal that drew audiences and earned her the name Queen of Paris. This young, queer Black woman made the white audiences around her marvel and question how they saw performance as she continued to shine and inspire other artists. In the bottom left, we have Marlena Dietrich. She spent her entire career toying with the ideas of gender, switching between tuxedos and feathers and veils. She used each role that she landed in films to challenged stereotypes of both masculinity and femininity. And in the bottom right, we have Gladys Alberta Bentley, who was a major star of the Harlem Renaissance. She actually began her career when she replied for an ad for a male pianist. So she cross-dressed and dragged up for the interview, got the job, and became became a star as a cross-dressing musician. Flirting with women in the audience and hammering on the keys, she captured audiences everywhere. And as a Black gender non-conforming lesbian, she was definitely a trailblazer. Next slide, please. Also, throughout this time, there were some large influences on glamour. We will go to the next slide and I'll talk you through some of these ones listed here. In the top left corner, we have the Takazuka troupe in Japan. This was formed in 1914, and the troupe was so successful that they kept performing through both of the world wars. Becoming more flamboyant over time, the makeup and the costumes vary from each production, but the key feature of the troupe was that women play both male and female roles, and they still do today. In the early 20th century US, silent films were starting to show drag characters. Typically, drag was the punchline, and the actors relied on bad costumes and their masculine mannerisms for the jokes. The Chaplin brothers, however, committed more wholly to the feminine illusion in films like The Masquerader and Charlie's Aunt. The Jewel Box Revue of the time was an all drag performance troupe that was founded in 1939, which was following a strict crackdown on queer communities. The troupe spawned many stars and always focused on blending elegance and witty entertainment. The Takazuka troupe was formed in Japan in response to the president wanting to boost tourism and ticket sales to the coastal resort of that city. He had this idea to train women to perform in a Western way as opposed to the traditional Japanese way, and thus this troupe was born from the Western influence. And again, still is performing today. Victor Victoria is a 1933 German language film depicting the life of an actress who follows advice to become a female impersonator. This was a standout film of the time because it showed what we know now, but wasn't a popular idea back then, that women could be amazing drag queens just as men could. This film brought the art of drag to a more mainstream audience while staying true to the 1920s aesthetics of drag. It was remade in the 80s with Julie Andrews, which some of you may be familiar with. In the bottom left, we see Stormy Delivery. She joined the Jewel Box Revue, becoming the MC and their first ever drag king, but was a singer and performer long before joining the troupe. Stormy was a prominent activist in the scene and admittedly threw the first punch at the infamous Stonewall riots. We will talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. On the right are Lynn Carter and Laverne Cummings, both members of the Jewel Box Revue as well. Carter was a celebrity impersonator doing a famous Josephine Baker. Laverne was known primarily for his vocal range and the ability to switch between highs and lows, the snap of a finger. Detailed drag for these two and charismatic personalities scored them really impressive and long-lasting careers. Next, please. Wonderful. Carrying on the tradition of challenging the social norms, drag performers challenged oppressive systems and openly fought for their rights as queer people, not just as performers on a stage. Wider society began to understand drag entertainers as more than just entertainment for them. They were fighters and activists and leaders in the community. We've already seen some popular performers being involved in activism, and the parallel between the two only increases. The 1950s to the 1970s was a huge time for the community, many uprisings leading to the liberation movement. In Canada, we saw homosexuality be decriminalized in 1969, following some of the events in the US that we're going to talk about. In 1959, what is thought to be America's first queer uprising happened in Los Angeles. The donut shop was tucked away in what was known as the queer ghetto, and therefore police officers routinely came and harassed the folks that were there. On one night in May of 1959, the police were met with violent resistance after attempting to arrest some of the people there. While reinforcements came quick and it was quickly shut down, the small uprising set the tone for the entire decade. The underground ball culture that's mentioned here developed as a subculture to the increasingly popular ball culture that was occurring in the States. The underground, however, was focused on Black and Latin artists. As balls prior to the 1960s thrown by white people, people of color were expected to lighten their faces and often didn't get a lot of the prizes that were given out. After the 1960s, the development of the underground ball culture and the house system as we know it was meant to be devoid of racism while still centering the competitive nature of the queer and gender dance presentations. This is really well showcased in the 1990 film Paris is Burning. The balls were a way for these artists to live in a fantasy or an identity that the social structures of the time would not allow them to do. Next, please. All right. This is one of my favorite slides and I can't wait to talk about it. In the top left, we have Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera alongside aforementioned Stormy Lavery, were some of the leaders during the Stonewall riots. Stonewall Inn at the time was a worn down bar that was managed by a mafioso, so they could skirt around the liquor license and have folks there. In the bottom center, we see an image of the Stonewall Inn there. On June 28th in 1969, plainclothes police officers raided the Stonewall Inn, checking IDs, invading bathrooms, harassing patrons that were there, but they immediately began to refuse cooperation with the police and taunt the officers from outside of the bar once they were thrown out. Outside of the bar, it's said that many different fights broke out. Molotov cocktails were thrown, fist fights, and a week of riots followed that were heard around the world. Again, this was led by Black trans folks and drag artists. Gender nonconforming people of color led the revolution and then banded together to form organizations such as STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. In the middle on the top, we see Crystal LaBeija. She became the mother of the House of LaBeija. In the film The Queen, she comes third runner-up and exits the stage in rage. She ends the film with strong words about how she felt the competition was rigged so that the white queen would win, not because she was the most beautiful, but because she was white. She was and continued to be fed up with discrimination against Black and Latin artists. In the 1970s, Crystal and another queen named Lottie created a ball that would birth the house system as it is today, Crystal becoming the mother to the House of LaBeija. The house was meant to provide not only support and care for those without a blood family, but also offering medical assistance and protection to each other, quickly becoming communities of refuge for queer youth and adults alike. Next, please. Freakiness has always been a part of drag, but the era following the riots led to rebellion in many art forms. While this era was important for the freakiness and the art development of weird, in Toronto there was an event that deemed the Canadian parallel to the Stonewall riots. The Toronto Bathhouse raids took place on February 5th, 1981. Around 200 police officers raided Toronto's bathhouses and made hundreds of arrests. Most of those who were arrested faced taunts and harassment from the police, and then were later released after being found innocent for their obscenity charges. The protests that followed these raids marked a turning point for not only Toronto's gay community, but for Canada's as a whole. The following evening, a midnight march peaking at about 3,000 participants proceeded down Toronto's main street towards the police station and Parliament buildings. This was also the year that Lesbian and Gay Pride Day was established in Toronto, though they were not endorsed by the city until 1991, so a full decade later. These were raids of Toronto bathhouses, gay and lesbian strip clubs, and the nightclubs continued until the year 2000. Next, please. All right. In the top left corner here, we see Andy Warhol. He was inspired by drag queens and their glamorous world. He saw them dedicate their lives to essentially a real life costumed drama that played and with the ideas and standards of gender and beauty. He shot drag queens with the same camera he then shot Moroccan and Norwegian royalty in the decades to follow. So he really made it clear that these queens were royalty in the same way that he did the others. Pictured here is one of his stars, Candy Darling. Placing trans women and drag queens into his images and films, Warhol exposed a wider audience to their beauty, their wit, and their glamour. In the center on the top here, we have DJ David Moscano. He was frustrated with the mainstream club life and threw an invitation-only party in his New York City loft. Disco, helmed by queer artists and people of color, spread then into a worldwide phenomenon by the mid-1970s. In the bottom left, the Coquettes began as a hippie commune, fashioned glittery costumes, and they put on plays. Before them, drag was largely hidden from outside the gay community, and they have acted kind of as a bridging piece in a lot of places. In the top right corner, we see Divine and John Waters. They were a cult film team that shared a love for trashy counterculture. They created a queer art collective called the Dreamlanders and began to work on a series of trashy shorts. They built a reputation as the world's most fabulous but provocative freaks. Divine's most notable portrayal is in the film Pink Flamingos, where her character stops while strutting down the street, picks up and proceeds to eat a handful of dog poop. This team duo created Hairspray in 1988, which inspired the Broadway musical and then the 2007 remake as well. Artists of this era, like Grace Jones, Prince, and David Bowie, as all seen here, added theatricality while presenting in ways that were contrary to what people were expecting of them. Bowie and Prince rocking feminine attire and gender bending in their performance, questioning what being a male rock star meant. Grace Jones emulated masculine energy with her buzz cut and androgynous silhouettes. She has been shutting down intrusive questions regarding gender and sexuality, all while modeling and having a music career. Next, please. The Rocky Horror Picture Show was first created as a stage musical in 1973 and led to the 1975 film remake, which was made in just 6 weeks. The film combines glam rock that we saw from David Bowie and artists like Prince, sci-fi and horror and absurdity under the draw of Frankenfurter, pictured here, a self-proclaimed sweet transvestite. While at first critics largely ignored the film, programmers began screening them in their midnight cult slot, which attracted crowds who would sing along, ad-lib to the script, and dance in the aisles. And these are the screenings that are still very, very popular today. With this show, glamour was never the end goal, but the aim was to shock and freak out new fans who didn't know what to expect, while opening their minds to the possibility of maybe breaking some rules. The New York City Club Kids, as we see in the other two images on this slide, were a group of dance and club personalities in the 80s and 90s. In the early 90s, there was said to be about 750 members at different levels all over. Their aesthetic emphasized outrageousness, being fabulous, and of course, sex. To the club kids, gender was fluid and everything was do-it-yourself. This was known as the gender fuck genre of drag. Elaborate costumes and outlandish face paint created looks that were barely even human, never mind gendered. At the height of their cultural popularity, they toured the US. The movement's decline, however, happened when 2 of the promoters in the group were arrested, and the group disbanded then in the mid-90s. A lot of artists who were involved with the Club Kids still maintain careers today, or have gone to be involved with houses or different queer organizations. Next, please. So since the 1980s AIDS crisis, drag performers have been sent in a more political and even more radical way than before. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. Yeah, next, please. So we're going to start in the top center. We have Lady Bunny. So Lady Bunny is a drag queen who was the founder of a day-long drag festival called Wigstock. This festival lasted until 2001 and then stopped. Lady Bunny was a part of the New York City Club Kids that I was just talking about and worked with many different artists all over the country, and is notably friends with RuPaul. Amanda Lepore, who is in our top left corner here, made a name for herself working as a dominatrix, glamorous club kid. Self-titled the world's most famous transsexual, she became a hyper-exaggerated replica of a Warhol Marilyn Monroe. So already we're seeing the influence from, for us, the previous slides, but for them, previous decades of artists we're seeing now come to a pulp here. Amanda Lepore, blends hyperfemininity with charisma and glamour to have made a name for herself and even an iconic status. In the top right corner, we see the Miss Tiffany's Universe. This is a beauty pageant in Thailand for transgender women. It happens yearly, first launching in 1984 to combat the assumptions by police and bystanders that trans women were sex workers and therefore targeted for harassment and violence. This beauty pageant also donates money to charities and again gives a spotlight to these women to showcase their beauty and style. In the bottom left corner, we see Visual Kei. This is a rock genre defined by androgyny in Japan. Similar to Prince and Bowie, 80s artists leaned towards femininity and embraced the romantic style. So this included frills and gothic looks that we can see there. These artists helped to formulate a new brand of masculinity in Japan, if not drag. So they're really revolutionary. Oh, sorry, a little more. And then the bottom right corner, we have Moby Dick. He founded Club Casanova, which was the world's first weekly drag king party in 1995. He eventually took Casanova out on tours that sparked the drag king phenomenon across North America in the mid-1990s. All right, so now I'm gonna just talk about some things that are kind of happening right now. Thanks to the rise of RuPaul's Drag Race, social media, and a growing number of celebrity fans, drag has become bigger than ever. Drag artists aren't just underground provocateurs or showcases anymore. They are high-profile activists, community keystones, they're musicians, they're designers, they're many things. It also is important to know that in this time period, fairly recently, July 20th, 2005 was when Canada passed federal law allowing same-sex marriage. So still very recently in our time frame of history. Next slide, please. All right, so the Boulet Brothers Dragula is a drag competition show that specializes in horror, filth, and the disgusting. Think of Divine and John Waters. A series full of campy scares and a freaky and glamorous drag aesthetic. There's been a few seasons and it is just fantastic. It's a really different kind of drag competition than that which is most popular at the moment. The second image, so the first on the bottom, Conchita Wurst became the first drag winner of the Eurovision Song Contest in 2014 and has since launched a music career as well. We have Pose, which is set in 1986 and looks at the ballroom in New York City, finding community in people who are like you and in those who are different. They describe balls as gatherings of people who are not welcome to gather elsewhere. So this is a really, really great show as well. And then we have Legendary, which is another ball battle show. Each episode is a different ball that they hold, and the different houses battle through voguing, fashion, and attitude to a panel of judges, often including a celebrity judge. Drag has made its way from stages and screens around the world, changing the social norms and expectations as they go. Drag artists around the world are asking each and every audience member to open up a little, to open up to the idea that there's some mystery about gender, about presentation, about all of this that maybe is unattainable. What a divine mystery gender is, no? Drag as a boundary pushing, fantasy creating, community building, soul healing art form belongs in God's house. And that's where we're going with this. Speaking as someone involved with student Christian movement and a Christian myself, I have some quotes that are from the Student Christian Movement website. So we can see here that the Student Christian Movement is passionate about social justice, community and diversity, and radical faith in action. The Student Christian Movement, they are, while embracing radical ecumenism and interreligious praxis, they embrace the paradox of unity and diversity. Judith Butler writes from a perspective that gender is socially constructed and that the conventional notions of gender and sexuality inherently submit women to men. She also says that these same controversial notions of gender and sexuality are what people use to justify homophobia and transphobia. She reinvigorates the gender conversation, though, with her ideas that gender is actually made of what a person says and does, ergo, a performance that each and every person is putting on. It could be said that Judith Butler was saying gender is an illusion that one is putting on. She is talking about each and every person here, though, not just drag artists. If we frame our way of thinking to that gender is a performance, even out of drag, then the lines that were seemingly keeping you boxed in open up, and we begin to question what our gender performance may look like and what that could mean for us, for the world, for each other. But in her following writings, we can read a quote here from her saying that drag specifically is the site of ambivalence that reflects on the systems that we are actively opposing, but inherently stuck within. This is referring possibly to hegemonic or idealized identities, capitalism and consumerism, etc., etc. Drag performers use these systems and abuse them frequently with their performances as artists to explicitly get their point across. While the point is to abolish the system and abolish the discriminatory practices that exist, it's difficult to live and work within these systems without using them. In this space, as people who may or may not be affiliated with the student Christian movement and people who may or may not have read some Judith Butler before, we can read these things, and I'm sure there's already similarities pinging off in your brain, both between these two examples here, but also between what we have been discussing about drag. Is drag not passionate about social justice and community and diversity? Do drag artists not put their radical beliefs into solid affirmative action? Drag culture is all about celebrating the paradox of unity and diversity. Queer culture is nothing but that. Each and every single one of us is our own unique person and artist and identity, but we can still come together in a fabulous and meaningful way to care for and to celebrate one another in powerful ways. Next, please. One of the main uses of the word perform in the Christian faith refers to performing miracles or performing healing. God is the one who is doing the performing most of the time, aren't they? Performing miracles, performing acts of wonder, performing in creation, performing signs for us to witness this great love. It could be argued here that performance is precisely what God is telling us to do through everything that is miraculous. God's performances take us away. They provide an illusion. They hold a silk robe, maybe. We look to God's performance, a response to us, maybe, to let us know that God is listening. We look for winds, we look for shooting stars, we look for new life, we look for resurrection. Godliness lies in many things, but one of those things is performance. So why are we not performing God? How can we live into a performance of what it means to be a person of faith? We see here in the Colossians passage that as people of God, we must carry in us a heart so freaking compassionate that it endures and outlasts injustice and unpleasantness. We see on the other side, Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah about his role and whom we are therefore longing to emulate as Christians. He's here to bring good news to the poor. He's here to pardon and forgive and recover and set free those who have been oppressed, those who have been downtrodden, those who have been bruised, those who have been crushed by tragedy, those who have been tossed aside by government policies, those who have been estranged from their blood families. We can start making a lot of connections here between who we are trying to emulate as Christians and what drag artists have been doing throughout the course of history. Drag artists have been doing these things, banding together with hearts so full of love for each other that they house, they feed, they dress one another. They create houses and parent structures, mothers and fathers and their children, because their blood families refuse to have those ties anymore. These artists live into characters of social and political standings that they couldn't reach or that were not possible to them in that climate, just to feel liberated and to liberate themselves and others from the pressures that they were under and show that anything was possible if they believed it. And anything that they believed they could do was possible because God is telling them that they could do it. They have done all of these things while performing a role, while creating an illusion, while living in a fantasy, while relaying a story. Drag artists create their personas or alter egos with an image in mind of who they want to be. God calls drag artists to be who they are, to challenge what makes them insecure or self-conscious, to challenge the barriers that have been put on them, to challenge the notions of beauty, of draw, of sex. They're drawn to challenge those things and highlight also that which makes them weird and different, that which they can celebrate. In doing these things, drag artists over time and space have been the front runners in social justice fights and in creating homes for folks who have none. This all sounds like Jesus. This all sounds like exactly what we're reading here, that he is saying that he's on the world to do. And again, who are we as Christians but people who are trying to emulate Jesus? When I go up the steps at the front of my church and I'm dressed as a clown or as some other genderless art form, I'm doing so because that is the image of God. Every piece of my creative mind is accessed through prayer, conscious or not. And my understanding of love for oneself and others has been redefined by drag and by the drag community. I understand love and therefore God in a whole new way because of drag and because God calls me to be a drag artist. I understand divine and community love from scriptures and from ritual and from my communities of faith. But I learned a love for myself through drag. And it only makes sense to me to bring them all together, to talk about an all-encompassing love, an all-encompassing transgressive love that knows no bounds, no matter where the love is directed.